Okay, our next step is to modify the search form. So this was our user form up here. But next we need to make sure that we save data when the search form is submitted. And we're going to do that by adding a submit function to the search form. So we're going to check for a form ID of search block form, which is the search block that you see in the sidebar after you install Drupal. And what we're doing is adding a submit function to the submit property of the form. And notice that we're adding it as an item to an existing array rather than resetting the array. This is so that previous submit functions that have been registered don't get overridden. And we're assigning it person save search submit. So what's left is to create this function, and this is the function that will store our user data. Let's scroll down. So this function will run every time the search form is submitted. Our first step is to make sure that we're working with the right user. So what we're going to do is globalize the user variable and immediately assign it to another variable. The reason for this is that if we accidentally make modifications to this user variable, because it's globalized, it will persist from here on out. So any changes that we make to it will affect its usage in further functions. So we want to make sure that we are keeping any edits that we make inside of this function, and we can do so by assigning it to a new variable that's not globalized. Just in case it wasn't clear, this user variable contains data about the currently logged in user. So as the script is running, it's running because a user has requested a page, and that user that requested the page is being grabbed into this user variable here. Okay, so we're going to check to make sure that the user has allowed us to save search history by checking its status that we saved from the user settings page. So we're grabbing the account variable, and we're looking at the data variable inside of that, and the store search history variable inside of that. So notice that the user variable is actually an object, and it contains properties just like an array. And we're looking at the data array, which is actually structured as an array, and we're looking at the store search history key, and that's either going to be 0 for don't allow search history to be saved, or 1 for yes, allow search history to be saved. So we're checking to make sure it's 1, and if it's not, we're going to return from this because we don't want to do anything from here. We don't want to save any data from this search form. Okay, our next step is to actually save the data. So we're going to pull the data from the account if there is already search history saved. So we're checking to see if that search history has been saved already. If it exists, we're going to go ahead and pull that out into a new variable called search history. And if not, we're going to set an array. This structure is called a ternary operator if you haven't seen it before. Basically, it's a simplified if-then statement. It says, if this is true, then do this first item. Otherwise, do this second item. Next, what we're going to do is take the value that was submitted to the search form and add it to the search history array, which will contain our previous search history. And then we're going to save that into an edit variable. Now this edit variable is what we're going to pass in our next line to user save, and it contains any changes that we're going to make to the user variable. In this case, all we're going to do is change the search history, and the conventional place to store data that is specific to just our module is in the data property of the user variable. So just consider this edit variable as another version of user, except it starts out blank, and then we just add to it any data that we want to change. The saving script will take care of working through those properties and assigning them to the original variable, the original user variable, and saving those changes. So we're going to save it into the data property, and we're going to save it into search history. And we're going to pull in our search history array. And finally, we're going to run user save. In its most basic format, user save takes two parameters. The first is the user object. In this case, it's a variable called account, which is just a copy of the user variable. And the second is the edit array. The edit array is a very similarly structured object to a user object, except it's an array instead of an object directly. So you see right here, we're replacing the search history in the data inside of edit as an array. But when we access it inside of our user variable here, we're using an object to grab it. But you see it's a very similar structure below. User save will then take this data and apply any changes in the edit variable to the account variable and save that to the user table. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at the user table and see where our data is going to be stored. This is my database manager. It's called SQL Pro. It's a great one for the Mac, but you could also use phpMyAdmin if you want to follow along. So over here, we've selected the users table of all of the tables that are in the database. And over here are all of the columns that belong in this table. So some of these are pretty straightforward. We have our user ID, the username, the password, the email address, and so on. And then at the very bottom, we have our data column. And this will contain a serialized array of all of the different data that's being stored in the user data property that we just accessed in our function. So we'll come back here to take a look at one of the users after we've saved some data to the data column. I'm going to jump back to the editor. And let's go ahead and scroll down. We have one more function here, which is called persons user presave. And this is a implementation of hook user presave, and it will run whenever a user is about to be saved. So for example, this will run whenever the user adjusts their settings form or an administrator adjusts their settings form for them and saves it. And what we want to do is take that checkbox that we added to the user settings form and save that as a property inside of the user data column. Instead of running user save like we did in our submit function, there's an easier way to do this in user presave because we already have an edit variable, and the data that gets stored in the edit variable will then get run as a user save later on during the process. So all we need to do is manipulate this edit variable with whatever data we need to change, and then that's it. So what we're doing here is checking to see if the variable store search history is set in the edit variable. Now this will contain all of the data that the user has selected when they submit the user settings form. So we're checking to see if it's checked. And if so, what we're going to do is assign a variable inside of the data variable, which is inside of the edit variable, the value of what we added to the form, which is going to be store search history. So all we're doing is bumping this up one level into the data property of the edit array. And that's all we need to do in order for this to work. Okay, let's go ahead and make sure that our module is saved. Let's jump back to the browser, and we're going to install our new module here. Scroll down to the bottom where you get to the Build a Module section and select the Persons User API Examples module and click the Save Configuration button. Great. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the user settings form for my account. And if we scroll down to the bottom, we'll see a new chunk here called Search History. And there's a checkbox called Store Search History. Now we should be able to check this and submit it and have that check persist. Let's go ahead and try that. Scroll down to the bottom. Sure enough, it persists. At this point, we have everything in place to be able to store our search history. There's no interface yet to display that, but we can take a look at the data column inside of the user table whenever a search form is submit to verify that we're storing it as search history. So let's scroll up to the top and fill in a search. We'll call it test search and hit enter. Okay, Now I'm going to jump back to our database manager, and we're going to look at the content for this table, for the users table here. Now if we scroll all the way to the right in the admin column and refresh, we'll see that we have some data now here in the data column. I'm going to open this up so we can take a look. Now this is a serialized array, so it looks a little funky, but we should be able to pick out particular variables, particularly our phrase that we just searched for right here, test search. Okay, so this means that we're storing data in the data object inside of the user table. Okay, our next step is to build an interface to display our list of search history. So what we're going to do is use a couple of hooks in order to add that data to our user page. Let's go ahead and take a look at where that's going to be. I'm going to jump back to the browser, and if you go to your user page, for me it's user/1, we'll see our page here. Now it doesn't have a whole lot of information on it. What we're going to do is add search history to the bottom of this section right here. Okay,